Last time we saw Agabus had come down to Caesarea, and he took Paul's girdle, or what we would call a belt, more of a sash in those times, and it would have a pocket in it that you could use as what we would call a purse or a pocket to put a wallet in. Your money and maybe a few other little things in it. And we remember Agabus went and wrapped his hands up as if he tied them, and he predicted that who the owner of this belt was going to be have some problems in Jerusalem. And we also notice that the brethren then tried to persuade Paul not to go, and we can understand that. If we knew someone was going to be hurt or suffer some kind of persecution, we would probably urge them, don't go to that place. And you remember back a few chapters that Paul had been urged by some of the brethren not to go into the arena. They were afraid he was going to get hurt in that. And so we got down to verse 13 the last time. Then Paul answered, "What mean ye to weep and to break mine heart? For I am ready not to be bound only, but also to die at Jerusalem for the name of the Lord Jesus." When he asked the question, "What mean ye?" Another way to think of that in more of our modern language would be, why are you doing this to me? Why are you acting this way? Why are you causing me grief? So when we think about this, we would then ask the question, well, what are they doing to Paul? They're pleading in their tears that they're expressing. Well, he said it's to break my heart. You're breaking my heart by acting this way. To Paul, I believe that he would have looked at the possibility of suffering for his Lord as something to be joyful about. You remember in the book of Matthew, Jesus showed that we are going to have troubles and tribulations in this world, and we ought to be joyful people. There are several places in the New Testament which talk about this. The word break comes from synthropo, and this word means to crush together. Now notice how he's talking about this. You're crushing me. What would the idea be? You're crushing my spirit? I think that's probably the idea behind it. Zojates, in fact, went so far as to say that it means to crush the spirit, to break his heart, in other words, as it's listed in our passage. To dishearten someone, to cause them to lose courage. And I think we can understand how that would be in such a situation as this. What were they doing to discourage him? He knew. Paul knew, and he understood the depth of his love for Christ. He's ready. He's ready if he has to leave this world. Now, let's understand something about that. Paul did not have a martyr complex. During the 1st and 2nd century, there were quite a few people who were Christians who had a martyr complex. In other words, what they wanted to do is die for Christ. And unfortunately, a good number of those people who had that complex, you can read about it in some of the historical records that we have of that time, would actually go about in such a way to antagonize people so that they might be put to death. And that's not Paul. He's ready if that's what's called for by his visit to Jerusalem. If serving my Lord, if being his servant, being his slave is going to cost me my life, so be it. You know, he wasn't morose and acting like, oh no, this is a terrible thing, I might die. He's ready. He's like a good soldier. Whatever happened to him, did not matter as long as he finished his mission. I remember many years ago when thinking about things that took place in my military experience that we didn't think about the possibility. I mean, we thought about it, but when you're on a mission, the idea is you finish your mission. Paul was a good soldier of Jesus Christ. And isn't it interesting, so many times in the writings of Paul, we find references to this idea of being a good soldier of Jesus Christ, suffering the hardships that a soldier endures in being faithful to the mission, faithful to his leader, whoever that may be. Understand, again, Paul did not have a martyr complex. He was not seeking persecution. Persecution simply came because he followed God's commands. And Jesus, you think about Jesus for a minute. When you look at the accounts of Jesus as he's preparing to go to the cross on that last day with his disciples before that happened, the apostles in particular, did he not dread the agony of the cross? Did he not pray to his Father if perhaps this cup can be taken away? What cup? The cup of anguish, the cup of suffering that he was about to endure on the cross. Oh, he dreaded the idea of dying, and yet he said, not my will, but thine be done. If this is what the Father required in order to have our salvation bought and paid for, then Jesus was willing to do it. And I think that's very much the idea that Paul had with regard to whatever he might endure in this life. And again, he did not seek these things. They came upon him simply because he was doing his Father's will. I don't think there's any doubt that Paul probably during this time remembered the physical abuse that he'd already suffered. I mean, he'd been stoned and left for dead as far as death is concerned. And now he's realizing that he's in for more. Would a sane man look forward to that? Would a sane man not dread suffering, pain, and agony? And yet there's a part of him which would exercise a joy for the privilege of suffering for his Lord. Remember what God told Ananias about Paul? I will show him what? How great things he must suffer for my name's sake. And Paul had seen a lot of suffering, and he's about to suffer some more. Paul's suffering to him, and I believe if we end up having to go through more persecution than just name calling and things of that nature that we endure now, Paul's suffering to him was incidental to his mission. And I think that's the way we have to prepare ourselves to see the possibilities of a maybe even a physical persecution in our lifetime. I was reading the other day about a man who was put in jail simply because he was standing outside an abortion clinic and praying. Wasn't hurting anybody, wasn't stopping it, didn't have a sign protesting and all that stuff. Well, what is that? Well, obviously this man believed in God. Obviously this man believed what the Bible says about the sanctity of life. And he knew that this is murdering an unborn child, a child that doesn't even have the same DNA as his mother, a different person. And that took place. And that's not the only incident that we could refer to in our society at this time. Whatever Paul suffered, to finish the course that God had set before him, he was perfectly willing to suffer it if that's what it called for. Look at verse 14. And when he would not be persuaded, we ceased, saying, "The will of the Lord be done." They couldn't convince Paul not to go to Jerusalem. The will of the Lord be done. Again, I believe this is emphasizing that Paul was not trying to be a martyr, nor did those at Caesarea want him to be a martyr. They didn't want him to die. They were trying to persuade him not to go because they were afraid he would die. Well, look at verse 15 and 16. And after those days, we took up our carriages and went up to Jerusalem. There went with us also certain of the disciples of Caesarea, and brought with them one Manason of Cyprus, an old disciple with whom we should lodge. Now, carriages is an old English word for baggage. And I remember our King James Bibles were written under that old English verbiage. And so it's an old English word for baggage. They picked up their baggage. They picked up their belongings, the things that they carried with them, and they head for Jerusalem. An old disciple is mentioned here as traveling with them to Jerusalem. This man's name is Manason. And it's interesting to me that this man, this is all we know about him, just what's recorded here. The word old here does not necessarily refer to age. It appears to us as we think about it here in this text that maybe that's the meaning of it. He's an old man. But it could refer to a length of time. The original word it can refer to either somebody who is old or something that is very old, or it could refer to a certain length of time. Is it possible that what it's actually referring to here is his length of time as a disciple? And I think that's something that's worth considering. Was he one of the 3,000 on Pentecost? Or had he been one of John's disciples who would have been absorbed and were those who those 3,000 were added to on the day of Pentecost when the church began? Whichever it is, here's a man that's mentioned to us. And in verse 17 beginning, he says, and when we were come to Jerusalem, or by the way, notice they're going to lodge with him. Apparently this man had a place in Jerusalem, even though he does not appear to be living all the time in Jerusalem. Maybe what we might call a summer house or something there, or whatever. But in verse 17, and when we were come to Jerusalem, the brethren received us gladly. And the day following, Paul went in with us unto James, and all the elders were present. And when he had saluted them, he declared particularly what things God had wrought among the Gentiles by his ministry. Notice the brethren, first of all, received Paul gladly. That's interesting to me with regard to something that's going to take place a little bit later. The word gladly in this passage, asmin ose, and this means with pleasure, gladly. They were happy to see Paul. They had great joy with seeing him. There was a gladness. Here's Paul. He's been away for a long time. We've been hearing things about Paul, and obviously they would have been, and now they get to be in his presence again. And that's the way it should be with brethren in the church today. When we greet each other, Are we happy to see each other? You know, one of the things I pay attention to when I walk in the door at Jackson, when I walk in the door here, I see Catrice smiling real big when she looks at me, and I see Tammy and others. You smile. Why? I hope it means you're glad to see me. I hope it's not a smiling, we're getting ready to make a little sacrifice of Bob here. You understand what I'm saying? We ought to be people who have joy and happiness and gladness to be among brethren. And that's what we see here when Paul gets to Jerusalem. He's among friends. He's among people who care about him. Have you ever noticed how some brethren greet some other brethren and they don't greet them with joy? They don't act like maybe they'd like to be around them. I was in a congregation, I was preaching for a congregation in Virginia, and y'all remember about a famous, actually it was a war in Kentucky years ago, Hatfields and McCoys, and they were killing each other off, and finally, if I remember right, they had to bring in federal troops or maybe the National Guard to try and put an end to all of this killing. But the Hatfields and the McCoys, in this congregation, it was a congregation of about, I think it was about 175 to 200, something like that. Anyway, they had two sections of seating with a center aisle. You know, that's biblical, you know. But they had these two sections, and one of them, the McCoy, sat way over at the last possible seat on the other side of the auditorium, and the McCoy did the same on that side. And never the two would meet. If they happened to run into each other, they weren't happy. That feud was still going on. Unbelievable. But they're brethren, and they both expect to go to heaven. Now, I ask the question, how can they expect to go to heaven when they can't even get along with each other here on earth? Don't want to have anything to do with each other. That's an impossibility. We need to make sure in our congregations that we greet everybody as much as possible alike. We may not have that many things in common with some of the brethren, but they're still our brethren. Another question that would be asked from the text that we just read was, who is this James? Notice in Acts 12, in verse 17, you'll remember that Peter had been imprisoned by Herod, intending to sacrifice Peter, to kill him, to make him a martyr to Christians. And Peter was released by an angel of God. The chains fell off of him, chained to two Roman guards. The doors opened up automatically. And I don't know if you've studied it, but the doors of that particular prison, not the individual cells, but the outer door of the stronghold, so to speak, was a door that it took a number of men to open. Couldn't be opened by one. It was so big and so heavy. And it just opened up too and let Peter and the angel walk out. You remember that was the context of Acts chapter 12. And in that context, we notice that this messenger freed Peter, and then Peter wanted the brethren that he went to their house to tell James and the others about his release. I think this is the same James. This is the same James, I believe, who presided over the council that discussed the Greek Christians responsibilities and things they didn't need to do and be involved in. Acts chapter 15 and verse 13. I believe this is the same James that's called James the Lord's brother in Galatians 1 and verse 19. And you might also compare Mark chapter 6 and verse 3 with that. I believe I know that he was not the Apostle James. How do I know that? Because in Acts 12 and verse 17, we know that Herod had murdered James, the apostle. And so James here is a very important person in the early church in Jerusalem. And notice that when he had saluted them, he declared particularly what things God had wrought among the Gentiles through himself, through his ministry. The word saluted is an interesting word because it means to enfold in the arms. So now you see this picture. The brethren were happy to see Paul. They're hugging him. They're enfolding him in their arms, and likewise, I'm sure he was doing the same to them. That's the idea of this original word here. To draw to oneself, to salute. Strong and Thayer give those definitions. But notice another word in that text. When he had saluted them, he declared particularly what things God had wrought among the Gentiles through his ministry. Particularly. Hekastos. It means each and every. Both Strong and Thayer just simply gave that definition. Each and every. Particularly, he described each and everything that God had done on his journeys. That must have taken a long time, don't you think? He rehearsed. The American Standard, notice how it translates this section. He rehearsed one by one. He didn't leave anything out. He told them everything that had happened. Just imagine taking the time to tell them all of these things, make sure they understood all that had happened. That would include all of the imprisonments that he was involved in, all of the mobs that were raised against him, all of the ill treatment, and more importantly, the accomplishments of God's word among the Gentiles. So he gave a full and precise account of all that had happened. Notice the last part of that passage. What things God wrought among the Gentiles by his ministry. Who did he give the credit to? He didn't sit back like, I've seen, and I'm sure you have too, brag letters and things like this, and where people just, look at what I have done. And Paul wasn't like that, and we shouldn't be either. If we accomplish anything to the credit and glory of God, we need to give God the credit. We couldn't do anything without those precious words that he's provided us with. Without the majesty and almightiness of God that took the time to be gracious to us in providing us with everything we need to know about him and his will for us. And the establishment of the church. All credit belongs to God. And when we relate some event, that is baptisms, etc., do we do what Paul did? Or do we just stop and say, well, I baptized 13 people last year. I baptized 2 people last year. On this missionary journey. Do we just stop there? We shouldn't. All the credit all the glory belongs to God. It doesn't belong to us as human beings, no matter what we may be able to accomplish in this world that honors Him. Look at verses 20 and 21. And when they heard it, when they heard all of these details of all the things that had taken place, they glorified the Lord. Who did Paul give credit to? The Lord. Gave credit to God. And when they heard it, they glorified the Lord and said unto him, Thou seest, brother, how many thousands of Jews there are which believe, and they are all zealous of the law. And they are informed of thee that thou teachest all the Jews which are among the Gentiles to forsake Moses, saying that they ought not to circumcise their children, neither to walk after the customs. Notice, first of all, that the saints didn't glorify Paul. Goes right along with what we saw in the last section. They didn't glorify Paul. They glorified the Lord. Paul exemplified being a servant to the Lord. What does Luke 17:10 tell us? Fits exactly with this. So likewise, ye, when ye shall have done all those things that are commanded you, say. What are we supposed to say? Look at me. No. We are unprofitable servants. We've done that which was our duty to do. We don't need any extra special praise for the things that we do that God tells us to do. We ought to just be satisfied that we've served Him the way He told us to serve Him. I like something that Jenny pointed out to me, and people send her sometimes little sayings and things, and I thought this one kind of fit into this context. It says, God is in control, but He does not expect you to lean on a shovel and pray for a hole. It's our duty to serve our God. It's our duty to do what He tells us to do in order to glorify Him and to enlarge His kingdom. God's in control. And I believe that's part of what Paul was getting at by making the emphasis. I believe that's the emphasis that was being placed on the brethren. They glorified the Lord. They knew who's in charge. They just simply were doing what God told them to do. And notice how many, next it says how many Jews, how many thousands of Jews there are which believe. Where's this talking about? Obviously, they're in Jerusalem. But what does the word believe mean in this verse? Is it referring to Christians? I know a lot of folks that say, oh, every time you see the word believe in the New Testament, or belief, or that kind of word, no, it always refers to no, it doesn't. It doesn't always refer to a Christian. In this text, is it referring to Christians, or is it referring to those who followed the law of Moses, being believers of that law? Or possibly, does it refer to both? Now, the Jews who believed in the Mosaic law, they're going to be sitting back and saying, oh, that old blaspheming Paul, that old renegade, that traitor to Judaism, well, he's been telling these people, you don't have to follow the law of Moses. He's been telling these Jewish brethren out there that they don't need to have their children circumcised. Well, some of those Christians in Jerusalem might have, because they had lived all their lives following the law of Moses. A lot of these ceremonies and things would have been ingrained. It would be hard for them to just give those up. It may have taken time for them to be educated in such a way that they understood that. Who did this informing about Paul refer to? Was it Jews who held to the law of Moses? Was it some of those Judaizers who went out of their way to trouble Paul in some of his journeys? You know, it was both Jews who followed the law of Moses and Judaizers. A Judaizer, and let me define that for you as I think about it, is a Christian or a Jew who had become a Christian and wanted to hold on to some of the aspects of the law of Moses and require them upon Christians who were Gentiles. So which was it? What charges did these Jews make against Paul? He's teaching the Jews in Gentile lands to forsake Moses. He's teaching Jews in Gentile lands not to circumcise their children. Paul didn't teach either one of those. He taught you should obey the law of Moses, and where would the law of Moses put them? If they followed the law of Moses as they should have, it would have pointed them to the Christ, and now they are Christians. They're not Mosaic servants anymore. He didn't teach them that. He taught circumcision was a matter of choice. Doesn't matter. You see, Paul understood it is a matter of, some of these things are a matter of choice. Some of these things deal with hereditary choice. Think about circumcision. Did Paul have Timothy circumcised? Well, we know the answer to that, yes. Why? Because he had a Jewish mother, and under the customs and laws of the Jews, your descendancy came through your mother as far as what you were religiously. Timothy had a Greek father, but his mother was a Jewess. That made Timothy a Jew in their eyes. Why would he want Timothy circumcised? So that when he was among the Jews, they would be more willing to accept him. Expediency. But, on the other hand, he refused the necessity of Titus being circumcised. Why? Titus, obviously, a Greek name. Obviously, Titus was a Greek. He was not required to be circumcised. And isn't that exactly what that so-called Jerusalem conference was all about? To determine what things were necessary for the Gentiles in order for them to be saved, to do or not to do? They accuse Paul of teaching the Jews in Gentile lands, don't walk after the customs of the Jews, the old law, the Mosaic law. Think about this. Why was Paul in Jerusalem at this time? He told everybody why. He said, I'm going there I want to make sure I'm there for the Feast of Pentecost. He wanted to be there. Now, why? Some have accused Paul of sinning because he participated in certain heritage customs. Was circumcision a heritage custom? Yeah. Was it a necessity for one to be saved as a Christian? No. And here Paul is in Jerusalem at this time to observe a heritage custom. Now, the Bible tells me that the Old Testament is written for our learning. Is there something you and I need to remember about Pentecost, why it was established and how it was established, and then see that it was on Pentecost that the church was established? I think so. I think all of those had something to do leading up to crucifixion and establishment of the church. Not that we have to celebrate Pentecost today. Paul didn't have to celebrate Pentecost anymore. Remember, the Jews had to go to 3 particular feasts in Jerusalem in order to satisfy the law of Moses. Paul knew he did not have to go to these 3, Pentecost being the one pictured in our context. But he did it as a heritage thing. He didn't go there to say, oh, I got to do this because, under the law of Moses, if I didn't do it, I'm in trouble. Paul was not celebrating these things as a necessity to maintain faithfulness to God. Paul had not opposed observing certain elements of the law, things that they had done, provided that the intent was not to seek justification on the basis of doing those things. And notice the text then says that these thousands of Jews who've heard all these things about you, they are all zealous of the law. That tends to tell me that those who were going to be hearing these things and causing a problem were either Mosaic Jews or Judaizers. This points to the fact, I believe, that those who were accusing Paul were those who believed the law of Moses must be kept in order to have justification. Or if it was the Judaizers that was involved in this, that they thought certain parts of the law must be kept in order to have justification. Look at verse 22 through 24. What is it therefore? The multitude must needs come together, for they will hear that thou art come. Do therefore this that we say to thee, we have 4 men which have a vow on them. Them take and purify thyself with them, and be at charges with them, that they may shave their heads, and all may know that those things whereof they were informed concerning thee are nothing but that thou thyself also walkest orderly and keepest the law. Again, for justification? No. They're going to hear that you came. How are they going to hear that Paul was there? They who, again? Ask yourselves that question. Well, whoever it is, it's going to be those who considered Paul to be a traitor to Judaism, to the law of Moses. It's going to be those who had tried to kill him on numerous occasions. Remember when Paul first came back to Jerusalem after being converted? What was attempted? They decided they're going to get rid of Paul, and the brethren got him out of Jerusalem quietly, didn't they? So these are going to be people who hate Paul. And he says now, or they tell him, James and these elders and any of the apostles that were there seem to be included in this, we have 4 men, and they've got a vow on them. What type of vow? We don't know. Some believe it was the Nazirite vow because of the shaving of the head that's talked about later. But Paul is encouraged to go with these men to the temple and purify thyself with them. Now, why would Paul need to purify himself at the temple? I believe it's expediency that they were talking about. Paul said he had lived in all good conscience before all men. Now, that particular statement is found a number of chapters later when he's talking to Herod. which would include this particular time of our text. Why would a Jew need to be cleansed if he went to the temple? The Jews demanded a ceremonial cleansing if a person had been in contact with Gentiles or in a Gentile land and come to Jerusalem. The law of Moses did not command such a cleansing. It was not commanded for the reason that the Jews gave in Jerusalem at that time. And again, I would quote from Jackson, whom I believe is absolutely right here. He said, to practice the rite in order to remove prejudice, since it's neither commanded in the old law or the new law, was an exercise of wisdom. And he cites 1 Corinthians 9:19 through 23. He says to offer a sacrifice redemptively would have been wrong. And he's right. Those sacrifices that they made under Jewish law, under the Mosaic law, had a redemptive purpose behind them. They're no longer applicable. He goes on to say, but there is no proof that such was Paul's intention. I believe he's absolutely right. Was it a sin for Paul to have Timothy circumcised as an expedient because of the Jews among whom he would be traveling and trying to teach the gospel to? I don't believe anyone. I don't think I've ever heard anyone say that Paul sinned on that occasion because he had Timothy circumcised. Have you? I don't think I've ever heard anybody make that claim. At charges with them, this was urging Paul to pay the price for the sacrifices that these men would make after their purification. It seems obvious that James and the brethren were actually hoping to blunt the attacks of the Jews and the Judaizers on Jesus, or on Paul rather. Let's come back here next week. I see my time, according to that clock back there, is up.